Do you believe in ghosts? That was the first question I asked as I sat down to tell this story, a story that haunts me to this very day. Some say it's just a myth, an old sailor's tale meant to scare those who dare to travel the open seas. But I'm here to tell you, it's real. I lived it. My name is Jack Turner, and this is the story of how I came face to face with the legend of the Phantom Ship. It all began when I accepted a job on the Northern Light, a massive cargo ship set to sail from the coast of Iceland to Northern Europe. I was young, adventurous, and, to be honest, looking for something thrilling. But nothing could have prepared me for what I was about to experience. We were 3 days into the journey when the fog appeared, thick, cold, and unnatural. It rolled in from nowhere, covering the ocean like a suffocating blanket. The crew went silent as the mist swallowed everything in its path, including the sun, leaving us in a dim, eerie twilight. Seen anything like this before? I asked Mark, one of the older crew members. He didn't answer right away. His face had turned pale, and his eyes were fixed on something far in the distance, something I couldn't quite make out. "It's coming," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the crashing waves. "What's coming?" I asked, feeling a sudden chill run down my spine. But before Mark could answer, the ship's radio crackled to life. "All hands on deck. There's something approaching." The captain's voice was tense, filled with a fear I hadn't heard before. We rushed to the deck, and that's when we saw it. A massive, shadowy figure emerging from the fog. At first, we thought it was another ship, an old one, maybe abandoned, but as it came closer, we realized this wasn't just any ship. Its sails were torn, the wood rotting, and there wasn't a single light aboard. Yet it moved, cutting through the water like a ghost. "The Phantom Ship," Mark muttered, his hands trembling. I'd heard stories about it. A cursed vessel, said to appear out of nowhere, bringing death and destruction to any ship that crossed its path. But I never believed them. Who would? Ghost ships don't exist, right? But this one did. Suddenly the temperature dropped even further, and the fog seemed to thicken, making it hard to breathe. My heart raced as the ship drew closer, and I could swear I heard faint whispers carried by the wind. Voices calling out from the other side. Was it the crew? The ones who had died aboard that cursed ship centuries ago? "Don't look at them," Mark warned. "Whatever you do, don't look directly at them." But it was too late. My eyes locked onto the deck of the Phantom Ship, and that's when I saw them. Figures, pale and gaunt, their eyes hollow, staring back at me. There was no life in them, just darkness, pure, cold darkness. I wanted to scream, to run, but my feet were frozen in place. The ship creaked and groaned as if it were alive, and I could feel its pull, as if it wanted to drag us into the depths with it. "Get back inside," the captain shouted, but his voice seemed distant, almost drowned out by the eerie sounds of the ocean. Suddenly, the ship's lights flickered, and the radio went dead. We were completely cut off, alone in the middle of the ocean with this thing. Then, out of nowhere, the fog parted for just a moment, and we saw it clearly. An old tattered flag fluttering atop the Phantom Ship's mast. It was the Jolly Roger, the mark of pirates. But these pirates had been dead for centuries. How could their ship still be sailing? "Is this real?" I whispered to myself, my voice shaky. Before anyone could answer, a loud crack echoed across the deck. Our ship jolted violently, as if something had struck us from below. Panic erupted. The crew scrambled, trying to make sense of what was happening, but the sea had turned against us. Waves began crashing against the hull, and the Phantom Ship seemed to grow closer, almost as if it were alive and hungry. That's when we heard it. A voice, deep and guttural, calling out from the other ship. "Join us." I froze. The voice was unlike anything I'd ever heard, filled with malice, despair, and an ancient hunger. It was calling us, beckoning us to follow, to join the cursed crew aboard the phantom ship. Mark grabbed my arm, his grip tight. "Don't listen to it. Whatever you do, don't listen." But it was hard not to. The voice seemed to wrap around my mind, pulling me in, filling me with a sense of dread so deep that it felt like I was sinking into the very ocean itself. "Turn the ship around," the captain yelled. But no one could move. The phantom ship was now right beside us, its cursed crew staring into our souls. And that's when it happened, the moment I'll never forget. A hand, cold and wet, reached out from the fog and grabbed one of the crew members, pulling him overboard. His screams echoed into the night, and then silence. Just like that, he was gone, swallowed by the sea, or worse, by the phantom ship. The rest of the crew backed away in horror, but I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, watching as the ship seemed to grow larger, its presence more menacing. And then I saw it, something glinting in the moonlight, hanging from the ship's bow. It was a chest, an old pirate's chest, covered in barnacles and seaweed. The treasure, the cursed treasure. Mark's voice shook as he muttered, "The curse of the treasure. It's what keeps them bound to the ship." Suddenly, everything made sense. The phantom ship, its cursed crew, the whispers in the fog. It was all because of the treasure. Anyone who dared to take it was doomed to sail the seas for eternity, never finding peace, never escaping the curse. And now, it wanted us. At this point, I need to ask you something, and I want you to tell me in the comments. Do you believe in curses? Do you think a treasure could actually bind someone to a ship for eternity? Let me know where you're watching from and share your thoughts on this legend. And if you're as hooked on this mystery as I am, don't forget to hit the like button. It helps us keep diving into these terrifying stories from the deep. But this is only the beginning of the story. And trust me, things are about to get much, much worse. The screams of the crewmen being dragged into the abyss still echoed in my mind as I stood frozen in place. The fog wrapped around us like a living, breathing entity, thick and suffocating. The phantom ship was now so close. I could see the details in its weathered, decaying wood. Its rotting sails fluttered in the wind, whispering the secrets of a long-forgotten past. "Move, Jack! We have to move!" Mark's voice snapped me back to reality. His grip tightened on my arm as he tried to pull me away from the edge of the deck. But my eyes were locked on that cursed chest. It hung ominously from the bow of the phantom ship, swaying gently with the motion of the waves. I could feel it calling to me, pulling me in. The urge to reach out, to touch it, was overwhelming. "Jack!" Mark shouted again, this time with more urgency. "You're staring too long. That's how it starts. That's how they get you." I blinked, finally tearing my gaze away from the chest. Mark was right. Something about the ship had a strange power over anyone who looked at it for too long, as if it could dig into your mind and plant dark thoughts. Thoughts of greed. Thoughts of death. "Everyone get below deck," the captain bellowed, his voice cracking with panic. "We're not staying out here another minute." The crew scrambled, but it was chaos. The ship was shaking, groaning, as if the very ocean beneath us was rebelling. The waves had become monstrous, slamming against the hull with a force that threatened to capsize us. The phantom ship, on the other hand, moved effortlessly through the water, untouched by the storm. It was as if it commanded the sea itself. As we hurried below deck, the ship shuddered again, and we heard it, the deep, unnatural groan of something scraping against the hull. It was as if the phantom ship was trying to latch onto us, dragging us down into the depths with it. Once inside, we gathered in the mess hall, trying to catch our breath. The crew was in shock, their faces pale and filled with terror. No one spoke for what felt like an eternity, the only sound being the rhythmic pounding of the waves outside. Finally, the captain broke the silence. "We need to turn back," he said, his voice low and filled with dread. "We can't continue like this. That ship, whatever it is, it's not going to let us go if we keep sailing in its path." "Turn back," one of the younger crew members, Jake, asked, his voice trembling. "But where will we go? We're in the middle of the ocean, Captain." "Anywhere but here," the captain snapped, his eyes wild with fear. "We don't have a choice. Either we escape this now, or we end up like the rest of them, cursed to sail the seas forever." Mark leaned in close to me and whispered, "You heard him. If we stay, we'll be part of that ship's crew before dawn." As the crew argued about what to do next, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I glanced around the room, but nothing seemed out of place. Yet the hair on the back of my neck stood on end. I could feel it. Something, or someone, was here with us. The lights flickered, and a cold gust of wind blew through the mess hall, even though we were sealed inside. The crew fell silent, their eyes wide with fear. "Did you feel that?" Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Before anyone could answer, the door to the mess hall slammed shut on its own, as if an invisible force had pushed it closed. We all jumped to our feet, staring at the door in disbelief. The room had grown colder, the air heavy with an oppressive, dark energy. And then we heard it, a faint knocking, soft at first, like the sound of fingers tapping against wood. It was coming from the other side of the door. Slowly, the knocking grew louder, more insistent, but no one dared to open it. Who's out there?" one of the crewmen stammered, his voice shaking. No answer, just more knocking. The captain grabbed a lantern and motioned for Mark and me to follow him. Reluctantly, we approached the door. The knocking stopped as we got closer. For a moment, there was silence. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, the fear so thick I could almost taste it. The captain opened the door slowly, the hinges creaking ominously. We peered into the hallway, but it was empty. No one was there. Just the cold, damp air of the ship, and the distant sound of waves crashing against the hull. "Is someone playing a sick joke?" the captain muttered under his breath. But as he stepped into the hallway, something caught my eye. There, on the floor, was a puddle of water. Not just any water, though. This was dark, murky, like the kind you'd find at the bottom of the ocean, and it was leading somewhere. The puddle formed a trail, disappearing around the corner. "I don't like this," Mark whispered. "I don't like this at all." "Neither do I," I said, my voice barely audible. But we followed the trail anyway. It led us deeper into the ship, past the cargo hold and toward the lower decks. The further we went, the stronger the sense of dread became. The air was thick with moisture, and the ship groaned under the weight of the storm outside. Finally, we reached the end of the trail. It stopped at a door, an old rusted door that looked like it hadn't been opened in decades. The captain hesitated, his hand on the handle. He glanced back at us, his eyes filled with uncertainty. "We have to know what's behind here," he said. Mark and I exchanged nervous glances, but we nodded. The captain pulled the door open, and a wave of cold air hit us. Inside, the room was dark, the only light coming from the captain's lantern. But as our eyes adjusted to the dim light, we saw something that made our blood run cold. There, in the center of the room, was the chest. The same cursed pirate chest we had seen on the Phantom ship, now sitting on our ship, as if it had been there all along. No, no way, Mark whispered, taking a step back. How did it get here? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The captain didn't answer. He just stared at the chest, his face pale and his hands trembling. And that's when we heard it again. The voice. The same deep, guttural voice that had called to us from the phantom ship. But this time it was clearer, more insistent. Open it. My heart raced. Everything in me screamed not to, but the voice was so compelling, so powerful. The urge to open the chest was overwhelming. It promised answers, treasures, and perhaps freedom from the curse. But I knew, deep down, that opening that chest would doom us all. The voice lingered in the air, heavy and filled with an unsettling power. It repeated its command, this time louder, more demanding. Open it. My heart pounded in my chest. Every instinct I had told me not to do it, but it was like the voice was in my mind, digging deeper, trying to wear down my resistance. I looked over at Mark. His face was pale, his eyes wide with the same terror I felt. We can't, Mark whispered, shaking his head slowly. Jack, if we open that chest, we're finished. The captain stepped forward, his lantern shaking in his hand. Maybe it's the only way out of this. Maybe if we give it what it wants, the curse will be broken. I could hardly believe what I was hearing. You think opening that thing is going to save us? That chest isn't a key to freedom. It's a trap. The captain ignored me, his eyes fixed on the chest as though it had already claimed him. He slowly reached out, his fingers hovering over the rusted lock. The room grew colder. The walls seemed to close in, and the voice returned, more insistent now, almost hypnotic. Open it. Free yourself. I grabbed the captain's arm just as his hand touched the chest. Don't let it control you. He snapped out of the trance for a moment, blinking as though waking from a dream. He pulled his hand back, visibly shaken. You're right, he muttered, wiping sweat from his brow. We need to get rid of it. Mark exhaled with relief, but our reprieve was short-lived. Suddenly the ship lurched violently, throwing us all to the ground. A deafening crash echoed through the hull as if something massive had collided with us. What the hell was that? Mark shouted, scrambling to his feet. We rushed back up to the main deck, the ship now creaking and groaning under the force of the storm. But as soon as we burst through the door, we saw it, looming in the fog, closer than ever. The phantom ship. It had collided with us, its rotten wood scraping against the side of our vessel. The eerie green glow from its deck flickered through the mist, casting long shadows across the waves. And then we saw them, figures, dozens of them, pale, ghostly figures, standing silently on the deck of the phantom ship, their hollow eyes fixed on us. Some wore the tattered remains of pirate uniforms, others old naval jackets or simple fishermen's clothes. All of them looked as though they had been dead for centuries. "Get back!" the captain shouted, pulling out his pistol. But it was useless. What good were weapons against the dead? The figures didn't move, but their presence filled the air with dread. It felt like they were waiting, watching, as if they were deciding whether to claim us. Then, without warning, the figures on the phantom ship began to move. Slowly, silently, they stepped off their cursed vessel and onto ours. The first to cross over was a man with hollow, sunken eyes, his skin stretched tight over his skeletal face. He wore the remnants of an old torn coat, the insignia of a pirate captain barely visible on his shoulder. He walked with purpose, his eyes never leaving us. Behind him, more figures followed, each one more decayed than the last. "What do we do?" Mark cried out, his voice filled with panic. But before any of us could react, the captain stepped forward, his pistol aimed directly at the lead figure. "Stay back!" he shouted, his voice shaking. The ghostly captain paused for a moment, tilting his head as if studying us. Then, with a chilling smile, he spoke. "Your souls belong to the sea." With a wave of his hand, the air around us grew even colder, and an icy wind howled across the deck. The waves crashed harder against the hull, and the fog thickened, swirling around us like a living entity. The crew scrambled, but it was as if we were frozen in place. I felt the temperature drop, my breath visible in the air. The ghostly figures moved closer, their eyes glowing with a sickly green light. Suddenly, one of the crewmen, a young guy named Tom, collapsed to his knees, clutching his chest. He gasped for air, his face contorted in pain. "Help him!" Mark shouted. But before anyone could move, Tom let out a blood-curdling scream. His body convulsed violently, and then in an instant he went still. His eyes were wide open, lifeless, staring up at the sky, but his body didn't stay down. Slowly, unnaturally, Tom stood up again, his movements jerky and wrong. He turned to face us, but it wasn't Tom anymore. His eyes glowed with that same eerie green light, and a twisted smile spread across his face. The crew backed away in terror as more of them began to fall. One by one, their souls ripped from their bodies by the curse of the phantom ship. Each time, they rose again, no longer themselves, but part of the ghostly crew that had come to claim us. "We're doomed," Mark whispered, his voice barely audible. But I wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. "Mark!" I grabbed his arm, pulling him toward the helm. "We have to do something. We can't just let them take us." "But what can we do?" he shouted, his voice breaking with fear. "They're already dead. How do you fight something like that?" I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that the chest, the cursed treasure, was somehow connected to all of this. If we could get rid of it, destroy it, maybe, we might have a chance. "Get to the chest," I said, determination replacing the fear in my voice. "If we can get it off the ship, maybe we can break the curse." Mark hesitated, but then nodded, a spark of hope in his eyes. "Let's do it." We made our way back below deck, dodging the ghostly crew members as they continued to claim the souls of our men. The chest was still where we had left it, sitting ominously in the dark room, as if waiting for us. I grabbed the chest, but the moment my hands touched the cold, damp wood, I felt a surge of energy course through me. My vision blurred, and for a split second, I saw something. Images of ancient sailors, drowning in the depths of the ocean, their hands reaching up. Their mouths open in silent screams, the cursed treasure, at the heart of it all, dragging them down. "Jack, snap out of it!" Mark's voice jolted me back to reality. We struggled to lift the chest. It was heavier than it looked, as if the weight of centuries was pressing down on it. But we managed, somehow, to haul it up the stairs and back onto the main deck. The storm was raging now, the waves crashing violently against the ship, and the fog was so thick we could barely see in front of us. The phantom ship loomed beside us, the ghostly crew watching in silence as we dragged the cursed chest toward the edge of the deck. "We have to throw it overboard!" I shouted over the roar of the wind. Mark and I heaved the chest toward the railing, the effort almost too much to bear. Just as we reached the edge, the captain appeared, his face twisted with a mixture of fear and madness. "Stop!" he screamed. "You can't destroy it. It's the only thing keeping them from taking us all." "What are you talking about?" I shouted back, barely able to hear him over the storm. "The chest. It's a part of the curse. But if we throw it into the sea, they'll come for us all." They'll take us to the depths, and we'll never escape." Before I could respond, the ghostly captain appeared, his eyes glowing with malice. He raised his hand, and the wind howled even louder, the ship rocking violently beneath us. "You cannot escape your fate," the ghostly captain said, his voice like a deathly whisper carried on the wind. "Your souls are already ours." The ghostly captain's words clung to the air, heavy and suffocating. His presence felt like a shadow cast over the entire ship, sinking deeper into our souls with every moment that passed. The fog thickened, swirling around us as though it were alive, and the crashing waves seemed to echo the grim finality of his declaration. "We have to get rid of this chest," I shouted at Mark, my voice barely carrying over the howling wind and the deafening roar of the sea. "It's the only way." Mark's face was a mask of terror, but there was determination in his eyes. He knew, just as I did, that if we didn't act now, there would be no escape, no future beyond this cursed moment. But the captain, still blocking our path, looked utterly mad. His grip on reality had slipped away the moment we opened the chest. He was lost to the curse, consumed by it. "You fools!" he screamed, his eyes wild with desperation. "If you throw it into the sea, it'll be the end of us all. Don't you understand? The chest is the only thing keeping them at bay." The ghostly figures continued to close in on us, silent and relentless. The air grew colder, and I felt the chill of death creeping ever closer. I could see the same thought reflected in Mark's eyes. We were running out of time. Without another word, Mark and I braced ourselves and, using every ounce of strength we had left, pushed the chest over the railing. For a moment, everything went still. The wind stopped. The ship stopped creaking. The ghostly figures paused in their advance as though the entire world was holding its breath. Then with a sickening splash, the chest hit the water. The silence that followed was the most terrifying moment of my life. It was as if the ocean itself was deciding whether to spare us or drag us down into the abyss. The ghostly captain's eyes burned with rage. "You've sealed your fate," he hissed, his voice now more terrifying than ever. "There is no escape now." Suddenly, the sea came alive. The waves rose up like walls of black water, slamming into the ship with unimaginable force. The deck tilted violently, and we were thrown to the ground. I could hear the scream of the crew, mingled with the unholy shrieks of the cursed souls from the phantom ship. I struggled to my feet, my heart racing, my mind spinning. The ship was falling apart, torn asunder by the storm and the wrath of the cursed spirits. The ghostly figures were no longer walking. They were floating, hovering above the deck, their eyes fixed on us. Mark was beside me, pulling at my arm. "We have to jump," he shouted, his voice filled with panic. "It's our only chance." I looked around. The ship was sinking fast, the water rising up to swallow us whole. The ghostly crew seemed to be multiplying, their twisted forms becoming more and more grotesque as they moved toward us. "We can't stay here." Mark's voice cut through my terror. I nodded, knowing he was right. Without a second thought, we ran for the edge of the ship and jumped into the cold, dark water below. The sea was freezing, the shock of it knocking the breath from my lungs. I struggled to keep my head above the surface as the waves tossed me around like a rag doll. I could see Mark not far from me, fighting against the current as well. But the storm wasn't done with us yet. The ocean seemed to pull at us, dragging us deeper and deeper into its depths. I could feel something cold and unnatural wrapping around my legs, trying to pull me under. "Jack!" Mark's voice came from somewhere behind me, but I couldn't see him through the churning water. I kicked and thrashed, trying to free myself from whatever was pulling me down, but it was no use. The more I struggled, the tighter its grip became. I was being dragged down into the abyss. Just as I thought it was over, that the sea had claimed me, a massive wave crashed over my head, slamming me against something hard. My vision blurred and everything went dark. When I came to, I was lying on the shore. The storm had passed. The sky above me was clear, and the sun was just beginning to rise on the horizon. The gentle lapping of the waves was a stark contrast to the violent chaos I had just endured. For a moment I thought I had died, that this was the afterlife, a peaceful, quiet place after the horrors of the phantom ship. But then I heard a voice. "Jack!" I sat up, my body aching, my head spinning. Mark was sitting beside me, staring out at the ocean with a haunted look in his eyes. He was soaked, shivering, but alive. "We made it," he said softly, his voice filled with disbelief. I looked around. We were on a small, desolate island. There was no sign of the ship, no sign of the phantom crew, just the endless expanse of the ocean stretching out before us. The sun was sinking low on the horizon, casting long shadows over the desolate beach, as Mark and I stood frozen, staring at the cursed chest that had returned from the depths. The air around us felt thick with something far worse than fear, inevitability. Mark broke the silence first, his voice shaky, but laced with a strange, resigned calm. "There's no escaping it, Jack. This chest, it's part of us now. We were marked the moment we touched it." I could feel the truth of his words sinking in. The weight of the curse wasn't something we could outrun, no matter how far we sailed or how deep we tried to bury the past. It would always find us. "We have to open it again," Mark said quietly, his eyes fixed on the chest bobbing in the shallow water. Maybe there's something we missed, something inside it that holds the key to ending this nightmare. Every instinct screamed at me to say no, to turn my back on that cursed relic and never look at it again. But deep down, I knew that running would change nothing. The chest, the spirits, the curse, they would never stop hunting us. I nodded slowly, and together we waded into the water, dragging the chest back onto the shore. Its wooden surface was slick and cold, like death itself. Mark glanced at me one last time, fear and determination battling in his eyes. "On 3. I swallowed hard, my heart pounding in my chest. "On 3. We knelt beside the chest, fingers trembling as we reached for the lid. The moment we touched it, a sharp chill ran through my body as though the spirits within were watching, waiting. 1, 2, 3. The lid creaked open. Inside, the contents of the chest were exactly as we'd left them. Gold coins, ancient artifacts, and the small blackened scroll we hadn't dared to touch the first time. But this time was different. The air around us grew heavy, thick with an energy that hummed in the space between life and death. It was as if the chest itself was alive, pulsating with a dark, unholy force. Without thinking, Mark reached for the scroll. "Wait!" I shouted, grabbing his arm. "We don't know what that is. It could make things worse." But Mark's face was set with grim resolve. "We're already cursed, Jack. What's the worst that could happen?" With a swift motion, he pulled the scroll from the chest and unrolled it. The paper was brittle, ancient, its surface covered in symbols I couldn't begin to understand. As Mark scanned the scroll, his expression changed, from confusion to horror, then to something worse, realization. "It's not just a curse, Jack," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "It's a contract." "What are you talking about?" I asked, panic rising in my throat. "The scroll. It's a pact," he said, his voice trembling. "Whoever possesses the chest is bound to the sea. Forever. We're not just cursed to die. We're cursed to serve." "Serve what?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Mark looked up at me, his eyes wide with fear. The sea itself, the souls of those who've died at sea, they're bound to the chest. And now, so are we. The weight of his words hit me like a punch to the gut. We weren't just running from a curse. We were the next in line to join the crew of the Phantom ship, the ghostly sailors doomed to sail the seas for all eternity. No, I muttered, shaking my head. There has to be a way out. There has to be. But deep down, I knew there wasn't. Suddenly, the wind picked up, howling through the trees like the voices of the dead. The air grew colder, and I could feel the presence of something watching us, something ancient and powerful, lurking just beyond the horizon. Mark's hand was trembling as he dropped the scroll back into the chest. We can't fight it, Jack. It's too late. I opened my mouth to protest, to scream, to do anything to fight the crushing sense of doom that was closing in around us. But before I could speak, the ocean itself seemed to rise up, the waves crashing violently onto the shore. In the distance, through the thickening fog, I saw it, the Phantom ship. It was coming for us, the ghostly figures, the captain, the crew. They were all there, waiting, and we were their next recruits. Mark and I stood frozen, our fate sealed as the ship drew closer. There was no escaping it, no running, no hiding. The sea had claimed us. And now, the question I leave for you, the viewer. What would you have done in our place? Would you have opened the chest, knowing the curse it carried? Or would you have thrown it into the ocean and tried to run? Let us know in the comments below. And remember, the sea never forgets.